At the end of the 90s, a small team at Accolade fell in love with the idea of making a shooter starring giant robots, inspired by artists like H.R. Geiger and Yasushi Nirasawa. The team worked hard and ended up releasing Slave Zero, which made a bit of a splash on Dreamcast and was also later converted on PC. Unfortunately, the game fell flat because it didn't have a lot of marketing budget and also seemed to aim for quite the niche market that just wasn't there, unfortunately. Still, it was a rather competent game, which did gain a cult following, which might explain why today, 25 years later, we are here talking about its prequel, which is indeed Slave Zero X. While pretty sure there are not many interested in connecting the narrative dots between the two titles, it's worth noting that X goes in a completely different direction gameplay-wise. So let's enter a slave unit and see how X shapes up. So Gone is the 3D shooting gameplay of the original Slave Zero, because X goes for a sort of 2D, or maybe we should say 2.5D hack and slash breathtaking action. The story for the most part takes place during the levels, and we'll be playing as Shu, a rebel who is hell-bent on going against the sovereign Khan, or Sov Khan for short. And Shu takes control of X, a slave unit, which is half robot, half living being, and takes the war directly against Sov Khan, and trying to stop his evil plans of using these units for war. Indeed, during combat, Shu and X will exchange a lot of dialogue, sometimes even funny, but might be difficult to follow sometimes as the battle heats up. And indeed, heat up is the right word, because even though we're not in the kitchen, X features hard as nails melee combat, along with a quite complex fighting system that we need to take control of. Granted, it's not all combat, as there are some pseudo-platforming sequences, but they end up being awkward to control, and rather than a way to bury the gameplay, they seem a perfect excuse to make us look forward to get back into fighting. In these sections you can use double jump to hop between containers and crates, all sorts of obstacles, but they are dominated by this unpleasant sensation that our slave unit sticks to platforms, making each jump imprecise and hard to perform. Perhaps it's the meat coating, who knows. Anyway, back to combat, because that's the main dish. We're back in the kitchen, I guess. So this is a kind of a classic mix between Devil May Cry and Strider, as Shu has a great amount of moves and combos that can be strung together. By combining the classic heavy plus light attack and a direction on the pad, you can perform a lot of special attacks, some quite interesting even, such as a mass of flesh and nails that comes out of the ground. Yup, seriously. But during the fight, there are several things we have to keep an eye on. One is, of course, the classic health bar. Once that's gone, you're dead. Yeah. And one is the special bar. Once filled, will allow us to perform our moves with the maximum possible damage. We also have the burst, a technique which allows us to, well, burst, explode, throwing all the enemies around us far away. Excellent way to get out of some, thorny situations. There's also the fatal sink, a mode in which we can recover health while pummeling our enemies in the face. And we also have a limited number of grenades that we can throw in the face of any unpleasant enemies that we encounter. Also, we can hold down the heavy attack to make our enemies explode in a delightful explosions of flesh and bone. Okay, you get it. There are a lot of attacks that we can perform. But they say defense is the best attack, so what can we do defense-wise? Well, there's the classic dodge, of course, which sometimes seems to work fine, other times ends up being a very bad idea. We also have the parry. However, the parry is performed in quite a strange way, because instead of pressing in the opposite direction of the attack, like for example in Street Fighter, or with the, appropriate button, like, I don't know, Devil May Cry, parry can only be performed by pressing a direction on the pad exactly when the enemy is attacking us. So if they are right in front of Shu, you will have to press right on the D-pad at the exact moment they are attacking. Does make sense, I guess, but even after several attempts, I'm not clear on the timing of the parry. Sometimes it seems to require 100% precision, other times even as much precision as I can muster leads to complete and utter failure. Yeah, so in short, there are a lot of different mechanics going on that the player can easily feel utterly lost, especially since they are not really introduced gradually. Instead, what we get is a different number of screens that explain all these mechanics, much like, I would say, an old school manual perhaps. But you better read them all and read them well, because they are not coming back and you will be asked to perform those mechanics right from the start. Okay, the first few levels are not really that difficult, so the difficulty does not ramp up right away, but it won't take more than 20 minutes before you will find yourself in trouble if you don't know how to parry perfectly, how to dodge, and especially execute all the attacks that we discussed earlier. Unfortunately, we come to what seems like Slave Zero's biggest problem. The combat system seems to miss the mark more times rather than hit it. Even after completing several levels successfully and with a decent rating to boot, but we'll talk about the rating later, well, I never felt like I was in full control of my slave unit. Rather, I felt I was in the hands of a brutal and very temperamental fate. In the end, after dying several times at the end of a mini-boss, I decided, yeah, I'll go in on the button smashing, and I found out that it does work sometimes. So, yeah. Between levels, sometimes even within the same levels, there will be small shops where you can, take a break. We can spend the money that we got during the fighting session, and this is where the rating comes back. So the more combos we string, the better our performance, the less health we lost, the more money we will get. So of course we can spend the money to increase our health points, get more grenades, fill up our bars faster, and all the things you might expect. It's also possible to customize your X unit, even though it doesn't seem to make such a huge difference. But, okay. So I did mention at the start Slave Zero X as an hack and slash, but then I went on to explain all of complicated mechanics, so I would say the question is fair. Is this actually a Strider clone? A Devil May Cry clone? Or are we talking about a serious kind of old school fighting game? Well, the answer might be a little bit of both, which is not the most uninteresting mixture of genre. It could definitely work, but in the case of Slave Zero X, it comes out a little bit too unbalanced. It is a shame because graphically Slave Zero X looks quite amazing, with its 2.5D kind of early PSX era graphics with 2D sprites in front of 3D backgrounds. The team's idea was to make it look like an actual prequel that could have been released in kind of the late 90s, so a sort of alternate timeline that never came to pass. And yeah, mission accomplished. It does look very good. The lighting is great. There are so many different backgrounds and little details here and there. Fantastic. Soundtrack also pretty good. Complements the action with industrial and drum and bass. Also, we got both English and Japanese voice acting. Great. I love that feature. So, in the end, while I'm pretty sure that the team is working around the clock to fix some of the little problems of Slave Zero X, because this is really a passion project, and I know because I talked with the team a bit, unfortunately this remains a game that at the moment is a bit hard to recommend. Between complex combat systems that are really not properly explained, there's also a training room, which I forgot to mention, but yeah, it doesn't really change that much. The story is difficult to follow, and there's really no other gameplay than just, fighting over and over and over. Yeah, Slave Zero X can only be recommended to true fans of the fighting genre. So if you're hungry for biopunk robots and don't mind learning a complex combat system, I do think Slave Zero X could be just the right pile of meat and chips for you. Chips in the kind of circuits kind of way. Otherwise, yeah, perhaps best wait for a sale. So Voxel Smash awards Slave Zero X a 7 out of 10. This is a good attempt to bring back kind of a defunct little cult game from the late 90s, and while its complex mechanics do require time and patience to be learned and especially mastered, the end result might satisfy those looking for something different than the usual retro game.